The cemetery sat at the edge of a tobacco field, forgotten by everyone except the crows and the woman who came every Thursday. Eleanor Vasquez knelt in the wet grass, scrubbing lichen from a headstone so weathered the name had almost disappeared. The stone was small, government issue, the kind they gave to soldiers 100 years ago when the country was still learning how to bury its dead. She worked the brush in slow circles, careful not to damage what little remained of the inscription. PVT, James Holton, North Carolina, 35th Force, Devere, World War I. Below that, barely visible, 1895-1918, 23 years old. Younger than Ellie had been when she'd enlisted, younger than most of the boys whose bodies she'd prepared for their final journey home during her 3 years in mortuary affairs. She'd washed their faces, dressed them in fresh uniforms, made sure their hands were folded right and their medals were straight. She'd done it for hundreds of them, and she remembered every single one. That was the blessing and the curse of her memory. She never forgot a face, never forgot a name, never forgot the weight of a body bag, or the sound a mother made when they handed her a folded flag. Ellie finished scrubbing and sat back on her heels, pulling a small American flag from her bag. She pushed the wire stand into the soft earth beside the headstone and watched the flag catch the November wind, snapping once before settling into a gentle flutter. "There you go, Private Holton," she said quietly. "Someone remembers." She pulled out her journal, leather-bound, filled with names and dates and locations, and added another entry. Holton, James, Peter Koshich 30th Diver, WWI, Cedar Grove Baptist Cemetery, Alamance County, NC. Headstone weathered, no flowers, no family visits observed. Flag placed 11/7, 347 graves in 18 months. That's how many forgotten veterans she'd found in the small cemeteries scattered across the Carolina Piedmont. Men from the Revolution and the Civil War, and the wars that came after, their stones crumbling, their names fading, their service slipping out of memory one season at a time. She did this because someone had to, because the dead deserved witnesses, because every Thursday she didn't spend in a cemetery was a Thursday she spent thinking about the things she couldn't think about, the mistakes she couldn't unmake, the face she saw every time she closed her eyes. Specialist Darren Okoye, 21 years old, Dover Air Force Base, 2019. She'd made an error, a small one, a clerical thing, a transposed number on a form, a moment of exhaustion after 72 hours without sleep. By the time they caught it, Darren Okoye's family had buried someone else's son, and another family had buried theirs, and the calls started coming, and the investigations and the looks from her commanding officer that said, "How could you?" Ellie had been cleared, officially. The error was systemic, they said, insufficient oversight, inadequate staffing, a process designed to fail. She had been honorably discharged with her record intact and her benefits secure, and a hole in her chest that no amount of paperwork could fill. She didn't talk about it. She didn't talk about much of anything anymore. She lived alone in a rented room above a hardware store, worked part-time at the county library, and spent her Thursdays in cemeteries where the dead couldn't ask her questions she didn't know how to answer. The sound of engines made her look up. 3 motorcycles crested the hill on the old county road, chrome catching the pale November sun. They slowed as they approached the cemetery, then turned onto the gravel drive and stopped near the rusted gate, engines idling. Ellie stayed where she was, kneeling beside Private Holton's grave, her hand resting on the weathered stone. She'd learned not to assume the worst about bikers. She'd served with enough veterans who rode, but she'd also learned not to assume the best about anyone. The lead rider killed his engine and dismounted. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a white beard trimmed close and a leather cut that read, Iron Covenant MC, across the shoulders. The patches told a story. Vietnam veteran, chaplain, 30 years of road. He walked with the careful gait of a man whose body had stopped forgiving him for the things he'd asked it to do. The other 2 riders stayed on their bikes, engines silent now, watching. The older man stopped at the cemetery gate and looked at Ellie, then at the grave she was tending, then at the small flag fluttering in the wind. He didn't speak, didn't ask what she was doing or why she was there. He just stood with his hands at his sides and his head slightly bowed, like a man who understood that some moments required silence. After a long minute, He reached into his cut and pulled out a small American flag, identical to the one Ellie had just placed. He walked past her without a word, moving deeper into the cemetery, his boots crunching on the dead leaves. He stopped at a grave near the back fence, knelt the way Ellie had knelt, and pushed his flag into the earth. The other two riders dismounted and did the same. They moved through the cemetery like men on a mission, each one finding a grave, each one placing a flag, none of them speaking a word. Ellie watched, her throat tight. When they finished, the older man walked back toward the gate. He paused beside her, close enough that she could see the names stitched on his cut, Deacon, and the smaller patch below it. In memory of SPC Isaiah Hayes, 2009. "You come here every week," he said. Not a question. "Thursdays. We come the first Saturday of every month, different cemeteries, same mission." He looked at Private Holton's grave, at the fresh scrubbing Ellie had done. "You do good work." "Someone has to." "Yeah." His voice was rough, carrying the weight of something he didn't say. "Someone does." He pulled a card from his pocket and held it out. Plain white, black text. Iron Covenant MC, Veterans Remembrance Chapter, Deacon Hayes, Chaplain. Below that, a phone number. "We're having a memorial ride next Saturday. Every forgotten grave we can find between here and Charlotte. You're welcome to join." Ellie took the card but didn't respond. She didn't do groups, didn't do rides, didn't do anything that required her to be around people who might ask questions. Deacon seemed to understand. He nodded once and turned back toward his bike. "One more thing," he said over his shoulder. "This cemetery's on the county register for relocation. Developer bought the land 6 months ago. And all these graves..." He gestured at the weathered stones, the crooked flags, the forgotten names. "They're moving them to a mass site outside Greensboro, unless someone gives them a reason not to." He swung onto his bike and kicked it to life. The other two riders did the same. "You know something about Private Holton?" he asked, raising his voice over the rumble. "Something that might matter?" Ellie thought about her journal. 347 names, 18 months of research. She'd found things, stories buried in archives, records lost in courthouse basements, connections nobody had thought to make. She'd found things about James Holton, too, things that might matter, things that might change everything. But finding things and doing something about them were different. Doing something meant talking, meant explaining, meant stepping out of the quiet places where she'd learned to hide. "Maybe," she said. Deacon watched her for a moment, his eyes steady. "Saturday, 9 a.m., the VFW post on Maple Street." He pulled on his helmet. "We could use someone who remembers." The three bikes roared back onto the county road and disappeared over the hill, leaving Ellie alone with the dead and the wind and a card she couldn't quite make herself throw away. She looked at Private Holton's grave, 23 years old, 106 years in the ground, and maybe, if she was right about what she'd found, a story that deserved to be told. She put the card in her pocket next to her dog tags and stayed until the sun went down. The Alamance County Courthouse smelled like floor wax and old paper, the kind of smell that settled into walls and never left. Ellie sat in the records room on Tuesday morning, surrounded by boxes she'd requested 3 weeks ago and was only now being allowed to see. The clerk had given her a look when she'd asked for military service records from World War I. Nobody asked for those. Nobody cared about men who'd been dead for a century, whose families had scattered or died out, whose stories had faded into footnotes nobody read. Ellie cared. She'd learned that caring was the only thing that kept the other memories at bay. She opened the first box and began to read. Private James Holton had enlisted in April 1917, 3 weeks after the United States entered the war. He'd trained at Camp Sevier and trained to Greenville, shipped out with the 30th Division in May 1918, and fought in the Meuse-Argonne offensive that fall. He'd been killed in action on October 8, 1918, 1 month before the armistice, 1 month before the war ended, and everyone went home, except the ones who couldn't. But that wasn't what made his story matter. What made his story matter was the medal recommendation buried in his file. A Silver Star, proposed by his commanding officer for extraordinary gallantry in action during the assault on the Hindenburg Line. Holton had carried 3 wounded men to safety under heavy fire, then gone back for a 4th. The fourth man had been Lieutenant William Ashford III, son of a prominent North Carolina family, heir to a textile fortune, the kind of man whose survival made newspapers. The medal had never been awarded. The recommendation had been lost in the chaos of the war's final weeks, buried in paperwork, forgotten. And when James Holton's body came home, it came home to a small cemetery on the edge of a tobacco field, with no fanfare and no recognition, because James Holton had been black. And in 1918, black soldiers didn't get silver stars. Lieutenant Ashford had survived. He'd come home to his family's estate, inherited the textile mills, served 2 terms in the state legislature. He died in 1972, wealthy and honored, and been buried in a marble mausoleum in downtown Burlington. He'd never mentioned James Holton, not once, in 54 years. Ellie stared at the faded recommendation letter, her hands trembling slightly. She'd found forgotten heroes before, men whose service had been overlooked, whose medals had been delayed or denied. But this was different. This was a man who'd saved a life, who'd earned recognition, and who'd been erased because the country he'd died for couldn't bring itself to honor him. And now they were going to dig him up and move him to a mass grave so someone could build a shopping center. She photographed every document in the file, packed the boxes carefully, and walked out into the November afternoon. The Ashford Building sat on Main Street in Burlington, a 3-story brick structure with brass letters above the door. Ellie had looked up the company that bought the cemetery land, Ashford Development Group, LLC. The connection wasn't subtle. William Ashford III's grandson, Mitchell Ashford, had inherited the family business and apparently decided that his grandfather Savior's final resting place would make an excellent location for retail space. She told herself she wasn't going to do anything about it. She told herself that finding the information was enough, that she'd done her part, that someone else could take it from here. But there was no one else. There never was. The Ashford Development Office occupied the building's 2nd floor. Ellie climbed the stairs and pushed through the glass door into a reception area decorated with architectural renderings of strip malls and apartment complexes. A young woman at the front desk looked up with a practiced smile. "Can I help you?" "I'd like to speak with Mitchell Ashford about the Cedar Grove property." The smile flickered. "Do you have an appointment?" "No. Mr. Ashford is very busy. If you'd like to leave your contact information, tell him it's about his grandfather." Ellie kept her voice steady. "And Private James Holton." Something shifted in the receptionist's expression. Confusion, maybe, or the beginning of recognition. She picked up the phone, spoke quietly, listened. Then she set the phone down and gestured toward a door at the end of the hall. "He'll see you now." Mitchell Ashford was younger than Ellie expected, mid-40s, fit, with the polished look of a man who'd never had to worry about money. His office was large and bright, the walls covered with photographs of completed projects and framed awards. He stood when Ellie entered and offered his hand. "Ms. Vasquez. Ms. Vasquez." His handshake was firm, his smile professional. "My assistant said you have information about my grandfather." "I have information about a man your grandfather knew, a soldier named James Holton." Ellie pulled the photographs from her bag and spread them on his desk. "Private Holton saved your grandfather's life in October 1918, carried him to safety under enemy fire. He was recommended for a Silver Star, but the medal was never awarded." Ashford looked at the documents, his expression unreadable. "I don't understand. What does this have to do with—" "Private Holton is buried in Cedar Grove Baptist Cemetery, the cemetery you're planning to relocate for your development project." Ellie met his eyes. "The man who saved your grandfather is about to be dug up and dumped in a mass grave so you can build a shopping center." The silence stretched. Ashford's face had gone pale, his professional composure cracking at the edges. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I had no idea my grandfather—" He stopped, picked up one of the photographs, stared at it. "This recommendation, it says he carried 4 men to safety, including a Lieutenant William Ashford. Your grandfather never mentioned it?" "Never." Ashford set the photograph down slowly. "He never talked about the war at all. My father used to ask when I was young, and grandfather would just change the subject. I always assumed it was trauma, that he didn't want to remember. Maybe he didn't want to remember what he owed." The words came out harder than Ellie intended. Ashford flinched, and she saw something in his face that surprised her, not defensiveness, but shame. The development deal is already signed, he said quietly. Permits approved, investors committed. I can't or won't. It's not that simple. He ran a hand through his hair, the polished facade slipping further. My father ran this company into the ground before he died. I've spent 10 years digging us out. This project is supposed to be our comeback. If I pull out now, if I break the contracts, then what? You lose money? Ellie gathered the photographs, her movements sharp. Private Holton lost his life. He lost any chance at recognition. He lost 100 years of someone remembering his name. And you're worried about contracts? She turned toward the door, then stopped. There's a memorial ride on Saturday. Veterans who spend their weekends honoring the forgotten dead. I'm going to tell them what I found. She looked back at Ashford. What you do with that information is your choice, but I thought you should know who's buried on that land before you break ground. She left without waiting for a response. Outside, the November wind cut through her jacket, and Ellie stood on the sidewalk trying to remember how to breathe. She'd done something. She'd spoken. She'd stepped out of the quiet places and said words that mattered to a person who could hear them. It had felt like drowning. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. This is Deacon. Got your number from the VFW. Heard you've been digging into the Holton story. We should talk. Below that, the county board meets Friday to finalize the relocation. Whatever you found, the clock's ticking. Ellie stared at the message, her heart pounding. Friday. 3 days to turn documents into action, to convince people who had no reason to listen, to speak in rooms full of strangers when speaking to one man had nearly broken her. She thought about Darren Okoye, about the mistakes she'd made, the families she'd hurt, the weight she carried every day. She'd spent 5 years hiding from that weight, burying herself in the quiet work of remembering other people's dead. Maybe it was time to stop hiding. She typed back, I'll be at the VFW tomorrow. Bring everyone who'll listen. Then she walked to her car, got in, and sat with her hands on the wheel until they stopped shaking. 3 days, 347 names, and one story that might finally be ready to tell. The VFW post on Maple Street had the tired dignity of a building that had seen better decades. Ellie arrived Wednesday evening to find the parking lot already half full, pickup trucks and sedans and a cluster of motorcycles near the door, chrome dulled by the November gray. Inside, the main hall smelled like coffee and old cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning could fully erase. Folding tables had been arranged in a rough square, and around them sat more people than Ellie had expected. Deacon was at the head of the table, his white beard catching the fluorescent light. Around him sat a dozen members of the Iron Covenant, plus a handful of civilians Ellie didn't recognize. An older black woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, a young man in a suit who looked like he'd come straight from a law office, a white-haired gentleman with a notepad and the sharp eyes of a reporter. Deacon stood when Ellie entered. Everyone, this is Eleanor Vasquez. She's the one who's been doing the legwork. He gestured to an empty chair. Ellie, take a seat. We've got a lot to cover. She sat, her journal clutched in her lap like a shield. First things first. Deacon slid a folder across the table. This is Loretta Holton Banks. She's Private Holton's great-great-niece. She's been trying to get his service recognized for 20 years. The older black woman nodded at Ellie, her expression guarded but not unfriendly. My grandmother used to tell stories about her Uncle James, how he went off to war a boy and came back in a box, how nobody ever told her what he'd done over there, just that he was gone. She pulled off her reading glasses and set them on the table. I've been writing letters to the VA, to the Army, to anyone who'd listen, never got anywhere, never had the documentation to prove what he deserved. You have it now. Ellie opened her journal and pulled out the photographs she'd made at the courthouse. The Silver Star recommendation, the after-action report, Lieutenant Ashford's name, right there in the record. She spread the papers on the table. It's all here. Everything they need to approve the medal posthumously. Loretta picked up the recommendation letter with trembling hands. She read it slowly, her lips moving, and when she looked up, her eyes were wet. 106 years, she said quietly. My family's been waiting 106 years for someone to see this. The young man in the suit leaned forward. I'm David Chen, by the way. I work with the State Historical Preservation Office. If we can get the cemetery designated as a historic site, which this documentation absolutely supports, The relocation order becomes void. The county can't touch it. How long does that take? Ellie asked. Normally, 6 to 8 months. We don't have 6 to 8 months. We have until Friday. Actually, Deacon said, his voice heavy, we don't have until Friday anymore. The room went quiet. I got a call an hour ago from a contact at the county clerk's office. Deacon pulled out his phone and read from the screen. Ashford Development filed a motion for expedited approval this afternoon. The county board agreed to move the vote up. It's happening tomorrow, Thursday, 4 p.m. Ellie felt the floor tilt beneath her. Tomorrow. They had until tomorrow. That's not enough time, David said. I can't get a historic designation processed in 18 hours. It's impossible. Then we need another approach. The white-haired man with the notepad spoke for the first time. I'm Frank Reeves, by the way. Burlington Times News. I've been covering local development issues for 30 years. He tapped his pen against the table. The board can vote however they want, but they can't stop a story. If this gets out, a black WWI hero, a Silver Star recommendation that was buried, the great-grandson of the man he saved trying to dig up his grave, that's not just local news. That's national. Media pressure won't stop the vote, David said. No, but it might stop the bulldozers. Frank looked at Ellie. I need everything you've got. Documentation, timeline, the connection to the Ashford family. If I can get this to my editor tonight, we can have something online by morning and in print by Thursday afternoon. Ellie hesitated. The documents were one thing, but a story, a real story, with her name attached, meant exposure, meant questions, meant people digging into who she was and why she cared so much about forgotten graves, meant someone might find out about Dover, about Darren Okoye, about the mistake she'd spent 5 years trying to bury. There's something you should know, she said quietly, about me. Before you put my name in any story. The room waited. Ellie looked at her hands, at the journal in her lap, at the dog tags she could feel pressing against her chest beneath her shirt. I served in mortuary affairs, Dover Air Force Base. My job was preparing fallen soldiers for their final journey home. She took a breath, steadying herself. In 2019, I made a mistake, a clerical error. I transposed a number on a form, and because of that, 2 families buried the wrong sons. The silence was absolute. I was cleared, she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. The investigation found systemic failures, inadequate oversight, a process designed to break. But that doesn't change what happened. Those families... She stopped, pressed her hand against her mouth, forced herself to keep going. Those families trusted me to take care of their children, and I failed them. She looked up, expecting judgment, expecting the room to empty, the story to die, the alliance to crumble. Instead, Deacon reached across the table and laid his hand over hers. You know what that patch on my cut means? He touched the memorial patch on his chest, in memory of SPC Isaiah Hayes, 2009. Isaiah was my nephew, my sister's boy. He died in Afghanistan, and I wasn't there. I was stateside, getting sober for the 4th time, and I missed his funeral because I was too ashamed to face my family. His eyes held hers, steady and unblinking. I've spent 15 years trying to make that right, visiting graves, honoring the dead, showing up for families who lost what I lost. He squeezed her hand. That's what you've been doing too. 347 graves, Ellie. 347 names you've remembered when nobody else would. That's not hiding from a mistake. That's carrying it. That's doing something with the weight. Loretta Holton Banks nodded slowly. My Uncle James died because he ran toward the fire instead of away from it. That's what soldiers do. That's what you're doing now. She picked up the recommendation letter and held it out. This story isn't about your past. It's about his future. Let's make sure he gets it. Ellie took the letter. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was steady when she spoke. What do you need from me? The next 3 hours were a blur of activity. Frank Reeves interviewed Ellie, Loretta, and Deacon, recording everything on his phone. David Chen drafted a letter to the State Historical Commission requesting emergency consideration. The Iron Covenant writers made calls to every veterans organization in the region, spreading the word about the Thursday board meeting. By midnight, they had a plan. It wasn't perfect. It probably wouldn't work, but it was something. The board meets at 4, Deacon said as the group dispersed. We'll be there at 3. Every writer I can muster, every veteran who can make it. We fill that room. We make them see us. And if they vote yes anyway, Ellie asked, then we keep fighting. Historic designation, legal challenges, media pressure. Deacon pulled on his jacket. This isn't over until Private Holton gets what he earned, however long it takes. Ellie walked to her car alone, the November cold sharp against her face. She pulled out her phone and stared at the screen, at a contact she hadn't called in 5 years, Darren Okoye's mother. She'd written the number down after the investigation, after the families had been notified, after everything had fallen apart. She'd never used it, had never known what to say. She still didn't know. But she typed a message anyway. Mrs. Okoye, this is Eleanor Vasquez. I was stationed at Dover when Darren came home. I've been wanting to write to you for 5 years. I'm sorry it took me this long. I'm sorry for everything. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she hit send, got in her car, and drove home through the empty streets. Tomorrow, the county board would vote. Tomorrow, Private James Holton's fate would be decided by people who'd never heard his name. But tonight, for the first time in 5 years, Ellie had told the truth about who she was. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't peace, but it was a start. Thursday morning, Ellie woke to a phone that wouldn't stop buzzing. Frank's story had gone live at 6 a.m. By 8, it had been picked up by the Raleigh News and Observer. By 10, the Associated Press had it. By noon, the parking lot of the Alamance County Administration Building was full of news vans, and Ellie's name was attached to a story that had traveled further than she'd ever imagined. Forgotten. Why hero who saved wealthy white soldier's life faces grave relocation, great-grandson of survivor behind development. She read the headline on her phone, sitting in her car outside the county building, watching the crowd gather. The story had everything: the Silver Star recommendation, the racial injustice, the family connection, the impending vote. Frank had written it clean and sharp, without sensationalism, letting the facts carry their own weight. Her phone buzzed again. A text from an unknown number. Ms. Vasquez, this is Grace Okoye. I received your message. I've been waiting 5 years to hear from you. Can we talk after you're done with what you're doing today? I've been following the news. Ellie stared at the message, her eyes blurring. Grace Okoye had been following the news. Grace Okoye wanted to talk. She typed back, "Yes, I'd like that. Thank you." Then she got out of her car and walked toward the building. The board meeting room was standing room only by 3:30. Ellie counted 47 motorcycles in the parking lot, Iron Covenant members from 3 states, plus riders from clubs she didn't recognize who'd seen the story and come anyway. They filled the back of the room in their leather cuts, arms crossed, faces set, a silent wall of witness. The regular seats were packed with townspeople, reporters, and a handful of men and women wearing veterans' caps from wars that spanned half a century. Loretta Holton Banks sat in the front row, her reading glasses in her hand, her eyes fixed on the empty dais where the county commissioners would sit. Deacon found Ellie near the door. "You ready?" "No." "Good. That means you're taking it seriously." He pressed something into her hand, a small American flag, the same kind they'd been placing on graves. For Holton, whatever happens. At 4 p.m. exactly, the 5 county commissioners filed in and took their seats. The chairwoman, a stern-faced woman named Patricia Reyes, called the meeting to order and read the agenda item. Motion to approve relocation of Cedar Grove Baptist Cemetery pursuant to development agreement with Ashford Development Group. The room shifted. Ellie felt the weight of all those eyes, all that expectation, pressing against her chest like a hand. "Before we proceed," Chairwoman Reyes said, "I understand there are members of the public who wish to speak. We'll hear 3 minutes each in the order you signed in." Ellie had signed in first. She walked to the podium on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else. The microphone was cold against her fingers. She looked out at the room, the commissioners, the reporters, the bikers, the family who'd waited 100 years for justice. She thought about Private James Holton, 23 years old, running toward gunfire because men were dying and someone had to save them. She thought about Darren Okoye, 21 years old, coming home in a box because of a war on the other side of the world. She thought about all the faces she'd washed, all the hands she'd folded, all the names she'd written in her journal because someone had to remember. "My name is Eleanor Vasquez," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I served in mortuary affairs at Dover Air Force Base. My job was preparing fallen soldiers for their final journey home. She pulled the Silver Star recommendation from her jacket and held it up. This is a letter recommending Private James Holton for the Silver Star. It was written on October 12, 1918, 4 days after Private Holton carried 4 wounded men to safety under heavy fire during the assault on the Hindenburg Line. One of those men was Lieutenant William Ashford III, whose family built half the buildings in this county. She set the letter on the podium. Private Holton never received that medal. The recommendation was lost in the chaos of the war's end, buried in paperwork, forgotten. When his body came home, it came home to a small cemetery on the edge of a tobacco field, with no honors and no recognition. Because in 1918, this country didn't give silver stars to black soldiers. She looked at the commissioners, holding each of their gazes in turn. Now, 106 years later, you're being asked to dig up his grave and move him to a mass burial site so his savvy's great-grandson can build a shopping center. She let the silence hang. I'm asking you not to do that. I'm asking you to let Private Holton rest where his family buried him, with the honor he earned and was denied. She stepped back from the podium. The room was silent. Loretta spoke next, her voice thick with emotion, telling the story of a family that had waited 4 generations for acknowledgement. David Chen presented the emergency historic designation request, explaining that a decision was pending at the state level. Frank Reeves summarized his reporting, laying out the timeline and the documents. And then, as the public comment period was about to close, the doors at the back of the room opened. Mitchell Ashford walked in. He was alone, no lawyer, no entourage. He wore a simple suit and carried a folder under his arm. The room went still as he approached the podium. "My name is Mitchell Ashford," he said. "I'm the developer who purchased the Cedar Grove property. I'm also the great-grandson of Lieutenant William Ashford, whose life was saved by Private James Holton on October 8, 1918. He opened the folder and pulled out a photograph, old, sepia-toned, showing 2 soldiers standing side by side in muddy uniforms. "I found this in my grandfather's papers last night. He kept it hidden in a lockbox I didn't know existed until I went looking." He held up the photograph. "This is my grandfather, and this is Private Holton, the man who saved his life, the man he never spoke about, not once, in 54 years. He set the photograph on the podium next to Ellie's letter. "I've spent the last 24 hours thinking about why my grandfather kept this picture but never showed it to anyone. I think I understand now. I think he was ashamed, not of what Private Holton did, but of what he didn't do. He came home and got rich while the man who carried him to safety was buried in an unmarked corner of a forgotten cemetery." Ashford looked at Loretta Holton Banks. "I'm withdrawing my development application for the Cedar Grove property, effective immediately." He paused as the room erupted in murmurs. "I'm also donating the land to the Alamance County Historical Society, with a deed restriction that it be maintained as a veterans memorial in perpetuity." The murmurs became gasps. Chairwoman Reyes banged her gavel. "Furthermore," Ashford continued, "I've contacted my attorney and instructed him to file a formal petition with the Department of the Army, requesting posthumous award of the Silver Star to Private James Holton. The Ashford family will support that petition with whatever resources are required." He turned to face the room, the bikers, the veterans, the reporters, the family. "My grandfather survived the Hindenburg Line because a black soldier ran into enemy fire to save him. The least I can do, the absolute least, is make sure that soldier's grave stays where his family put him, and that his name gets the recognition it deserves." He picked up the photograph and walked to where Loretta sat. He knelt beside her chair and held it out. "This belongs to your family, Mrs. Banks. It always did." Loretta took the photograph with trembling hands. She looked at the 2 soldiers, her great-great-uncle and the man whose life he'd saved, frozen together in a moment a century old. "Thank you," she whispered. Chairwoman Reyes cleared her throat. "Given Mr. Ashford's withdrawal, the motion to approve relocation is moot. This item is removed from the agenda." She looked at the crowd, at the bikers lining the walls, at the reporters with their cameras. "I believe this meeting is adjourned." The room erupted. Ellie stood near the back, watching Loretta embrace Ashford, watching Deacon shake his hand, watching Frank Reeves scribble furiously in his notebook. The small American flag was still in her hand, clutched so tightly the wire had left marks on her palm. Deacon found her in the crowd. "You did it. We did it." She looked at the flag, all of us. "What now?" Ellie thought about Grace Okoye waiting for a phone call, about the message she'd sent after 5 years of silence, about the weight she'd been carrying and the places she'd hidden from and the names she'd never stopped remembering. Now I make another call I should have made a long time ago. She tucked the flag into her pocket next to her dog tags, and then I keep showing up, for as long as it takes. Outside, the November sun was setting over the parking lot, gilding the chrome of 47 motorcycles. The Iron Covenant riders were gathered near their bikes, passing around cups of coffee from a thermos someone had brought. Ellie walked past them toward her car, and one by one, they nodded. No words, no fanfare, just acknowledgement. She nodded back. Some things didn't need to be spoken, they just needed to be witnessed. 8 months later, spring had softened the Carolina Piedmont, and the cemetery at Cedar Grove no longer sat forgotten. Ellie stood at the edge of the new gravel path, watching the crowd gather around Private James Holton's grave. The headstone had been replaced, proper granite now, etched with his name and rank, and the words that had finally been spoken aloud, Silver Star recipient. October 8th, 1918. Greater love hath no man than this. The Department of the Army had approved the posthumous award. In April, after a review process that had taken less than 3 months, record time, according to the liaison who'd called with the news. The Ashford family's support had helped. So had the media attention. So had the 300 letters that veterans groups across the country had sent, each one asking the same question. How many more heroes are we forgetting? Today was the ceremony. Loretta Holton Banks stood at the front of the gathering, flanked by her children and grandchildren, 4 generations of Holtons finally seeing their ancestor honored. A brigadier general from Fort Bragg held the medal in a velvet case, waiting for the moment when he would pin it to the flag draped over the stone. The Iron Covenant had come in force. 63 motorcycles lined the road that led to the cemetery, their riders standing in formation along the newly built fence. Deacon was among them, his white beard bright in the May sunshine, the memorial patch for Isaiah Hayes visible on his chest. He'd told Ellie, a few weeks after the board meeting, that he'd finally visited his sister, had sat at her kitchen table and told her why he'd missed the funeral, why he'd stayed away for 15 years, why he'd been so afraid to face her grief when he couldn't face his own. She'd cried. He'd cried. And then she'd shown him the box of Isaiah's things she'd been keeping, letters, photographs, a flag he'd sent home from his second deployment. She asked me to keep the flag, Deacon had said, his voice rough, said Isaiah would have wanted someone who understood to have it. He carried it now, folded tight against his chest beneath his cut. Ellie watched the ceremony from the back of the crowd, her journal open in her hands. She'd added a new entry that morning, Holton, James, Piatrum 30th Div. WWI, Silver Star, awarded May 15th. Ceremony at Cedar Grove Baptist Cemetery, Alamance County, NC. Family present. He is not forgotten. 347 graves in 18 months. That number had grown since then, 412 now, scattered across 6 counties, each one documented, each one visited, each one remembered. She'd stopped doing it alone. The Iron Covenant had made it a regular mission, riding out on the first Saturday of every month to tend the stones she'd mapped and place flags at the graves she'd found. The quiet places weren't so quiet anymore, and that was all right. Ellie had learned that silence could be sanctuary or prison, depending on what you were hiding from. She wasn't hiding anymore. Her phone buzzed, a text from Grace Okoye, watching the live stream. Darren would have loved this. Call me tonight? Ellie smiled and typed back, I will. They'd talked 3 times since that first message, long conversations that stretched past midnight, full of tears and apologies and the slow, careful work of building something from wreckage. Grace had told her about Darren, about the boy he'd been before he enlisted, about the letters he'd written home, about the flag she kept on her mantle that Ellie's hands had helped fold. I don't blame you, Grace had said during their second call. I never did. The system failed my son. You were just the one it broke. It was an absolution. Nothing could be. but it was something Ellie hadn't known she needed, permission to stop punishing herself for being human. The general stepped forward and pinned the silver star to the flag. A bugler played taps, the notes floating across the tobacco fields toward a horizon Ellie had seen 100 times before. Loretta accepted the medal with both hands, clutching it against her chest, and when she turned to face the crowd, her eyes found Ellie's. She nodded. Just once. Ellie nodded back. After the ceremony, the crowd dispersed slowly, families taking photographs, reporters conducting interviews, bikers shaking hands and clapping shoulders. Ellie walked to Private Holton's grave and knelt in the grass the way she'd knelt 8 months ago, when she'd been alone and silent and certain that remembering was all she had left to give. The stone was warm from the sun. She traced the letters of his name with her fingertip, feeling the grooves, the permanence of it. "You did it," she said quietly. "You got what you earned. 106 years late, but it's here now." She pulled the small American flag from her pocket, the one Deacon had given her at the board meeting, worn soft now from being carried, and pushed it into the earth beside the stone. "Rest easy, Private. Someone remembers." She stood, brushing grass from her knees, and turned to find Mitchell Ashford standing a few feet away. He looked different than he had at the board meeting, lighter, somehow, as if setting down the weight of his grandfather's silence had changed the way he carried himself. "Ms. Vasquez," he extended his hand, "I wanted to thank you for not giving up." She shook it. "Thank your grandfather. He's the one who kept that photograph." "I think he was hoping someone would find it someday, someone who'd know what to do with it." Ashford looked at the grave, at the flag, at the medal glinting in Loretta's hands. "I just wish he'd had the courage to do it himself." Courage comes in different shapes. Ellie thought about the message she'd sent to Grace Okoye, the 5 years it had taken to write it. Sometimes we don't find it until someone shows us how. She walked back to her car, past the rows of motorcycles, past the families gathering for photographs, past the reporters packing up their equipment. Deacon fell into step beside her. "What now?" he asked. Ellie pulled out her journal and opened it to the next blank page. 412 names, and somewhere out there, more waiting to be found. "Now we keep going," she said. "There's a cemetery outside Chatham County I've been meaning to visit. Civil War graves, mostly. Nobody's tended them in years. Saturday work for you?" "Saturday works." Deacon nodded and walked toward his bike. The Iron Covenant riders were mounting up, engines rumbling to life, chrome catching the afternoon light. Ellie stayed a moment longer, looking back at the cemetery, the new fence, the fresh flags, the families gathered around stones that no longer stood alone. 106 years of forgetting, undone in 8 months by people who refused to look away. She wrote the date at the top of a fresh page and a single line beneath it. Cedar Grove. Not forgotten. Then she closed the journal, got in her car, and drove toward the next name waiting to be remembered. If this story moved you, subscribe for more tales of those who remember when others forget. And tell us in the comments, whose name do you carry?